On March 20th, 2003, U.S. forces in a so-called coalition of the willing invaded Iraq, where they alleged that President Saddam Hussein was building and amassing weapons of mass destruction. Less than 2 months later, U.S. President Bush declared mission accomplished and the end of major combat in Iraq. But instead of a quick transition to peace and democracy, as the Americans had been hoping for, Iraq spiraled into a wave of sectarian violence that has claimed the lives of thousands of Iraqis, as well as U.S. and other foreign soldiers. It's estimated that more than 2 million Iraqis have fled the country since the invasion took place. Here's a brief look now at Iraq over the last 5 years.
The invasion of Iraq begins. At the start, the United States and its allies believed victory would be quick. Baghdad was taken within a few weeks and Saddam's regime deposed. At the beginning of 2005, the Iraqis voted for a new parliament that looked like a success story. But the American troops hadn't expected to face a rash of terrorist attacks every day, which quickly became their biggest headache. Nearly 4,000 U.S. troops have been killed in Iraq since the invasion began. But the civilian population is suffering even more. No one really knows just how many civilians have been killed. The World Health Organization says the number of victims reached 150,000 at the end of 2006. Others reckon the number is much higher. Involvement in Iraq is costing the U.S. immense sums of money. Some analysts put the figure as high as $12 billion a month. A pleasure park in Baghdad at the end of 2007, a small island of normality amid the chaos. Even 5 years after the invasion, the people of Iraq cannot find peace in many places.
The security situation in Iraq over the past year has improved somewhat since the U.S. increased its troop presence there. In January of 2007, President Bush announced a change in Washington's Iraq strategy and put 30,000 extra troops in and around Baghdad. Insurgent bomb attacks still take place, but the Iraqis have made important strides in assuming more security control over their country. It's also been a requirement of the U.S. before it begins withdrawing its troops from Iraq. Our next report shows us how Iraq's economy is also showing signs of improvement.
Iraqi exports are increasing month by month. Some 2 million barrels of oil a day are being shipped from Basra's oil export terminal under the protection of U.S. warships. That brings around $1 billion into state coffers every week. The Iraqi government is in the money again. New oil fields are being developed in the deserts in southern Iraq, where there are said to be massive reserves. The wealth under the desert is intended to help reconstruct the country.
As we know, Iraq has the second largest oil reserves in the world. Iraq is expected to become the world's largest energy provider. We're going to overtake Saudi Arabia.
When Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled in 2003, Iraq's oil exports collapsed. But now Iraq is back on the world market, and it's opening up a range of new opportunities for the government in Baghdad. Now there's money to support an alliance against terrorism. Over the past few months, important tribal leaders and their militias have been won over. Since then, armed forces have been seeking out al-Qaeda leaders in the Sunni neighborhoods of Baghdad. They're being driven out of Baghdad and parts of northern Iraq. One of the leaders of the Iraqi pact against al-Qaeda is Sheikh Ali Hatam. He lives in Baghdad and heads an army of tribal fighters.
Al-Qaeda brought a radical ideology which has nothing to do with Islam or our culture. Because of their terrible acts of murder and expulsion, we had no...
Sheikh Ali Hatam has survived several assassination attempts by al-Qaeda, but other tribal leaders haven't been so lucky. Security is also improving slowly in southern Iraq. On the surface, not much has changed in Basra over the past few years. But behind the scenes, rival clans are locked in a fierce battle for power. The government is gradually widening its control across the country. Well-trained police officers were sent from Baghdad to help patrol Iraq's second-largest city. Many of Basra's old police units had been infiltrated by militants. Police officers still regularly fall victim to the violence, but this group is determined to demonstrate that the local security forces will no longer be intimidated. Basra's chief of police frees a group of prisoners accused of planning attacks on politicians. The general knows it's a delicate matter. Too many arrests could create unrest in the city. But if he releases the wrong people, that could mean more violence.
The time for justice and law has come. There's no room here anymore for people who want to do harm to Basra and its citizens. The end is near for those people. Some of these scum think that just because they're carrying a gun, they are masters of the universe.
It's taking a long time for peace and order to return to Basra. As elsewhere in Iraq, the government has to take things step by step.
I spoke earlier to Volker Perthes, who's the director of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. I put it to him that the Iraq War has lasted almost as long as World War II. And I asked him what positive achievements have been made over that period.
Well, if you take the entire 5 years, there's not so much positive to say because the region has been destabilized. Iran has become the strongest power in the region. The Arab-Israeli conflict has not come closer to a solution than it was 5 years ago. If you just look at the last year, you could say there are some real improvements in Iraq. There is more security for Iraqi citizens, and there seems to be a slightly stronger preparedness of the Iraqi parties to make compromises.
Now, with upcoming presidential elections in the U.S., do you see any change in Iraq policy on the horizon?
Well, it depends, of course, who is going to win the elections. I guess that a Democratic candidate or a Democratic president would try to set a date by which, or an agenda at least, saying by which time the American forces would be out of Iraq, both to do two things. One, to reassure those skeptical Iraqis who suspect that the Americans in the end want to stay in Iraq to control the oil resources, and also to put more political pressure on the factions that are there in Iraq to make compromises and not rely on the Americans and at the same time blame the Americans for everything that goes wrong.
Now, what effect would a pullout by the U.S. and other foreign military forces have on the region?
Well, it depends actually when it takes place. If it is a pullout and how it takes place. If it is a pullout which is coordinated with the Iraqis and, I have to insist on that, with the neighbors also, then it could be positive. It could actually also force neighboring countries into somewhat more responsibility. None of the neighbors wants a civil war in Iraq, and certainly not a civil war in Iraq that splits over or spills over their borders into their own countries. But as long as the Americans are there as the most strongest military force in the Persian Gulf region, the neighboring countries do not feel that responsibility and rather undermines the stabilization of Iraq than helping it.
Volker Perthes, thank you very much. And that wraps our in-depth report today. I'm Megan Lee. You're watching DWTV. Stay tuned.